So, guys, it's been a long day, and you have a lot to digest, and we all had a little load-shedding skrik, and if you listen very carefully, you can hear the ice being crushed in the bar. So I'm going to keep this short and quite simple, and I've specifically crafted the presentation to make sure that these are things that you can start doing in your organization straight away. You don't have to wait for liquidity, you don't have to wait for publications, you don't have to wait for guidance. You can literally go back to your office tomorrow and go back to your desk and start doing these things now. And to make it even easier to remember, I call it the 3 C's of transition. The first one, choose your champion, clarify your exposure, and communicate. Choosing your champion, it's very important. Why? Because nothing moves a program forward quicker than individual accountability. And this can be done both at an organizational or a team level. This person will need a clear mandate in terms of what a successful outcome look like and what they need to achieve. And they also need to be equipped with the appropriate resources. And that means people, it means budget, and it means time. They need to actually have the available time to work on a program of this magnitude and complexity. And I've listed 4 elements there as a guideline. These are not exhaustive, so the intention is to give you an idea of what this person should be looking at and starting to implement in the organization. The first one is to establish the governance structure and to have very clear roles and responsibilities in place. People need to be sure what they need to do, what they're responsible for. Do you have a dedicated project team? Not all organizations need that. If you have one, who do they report to? If you have an organization with many business units, how do you hold them accountable? So these things need to be cleared up fairly soon. Second one is to develop the delivery work streams, and there are many of those. And also to construct that end-to-end transition plan. And that will be very difficult because, as you can see, our transition program is still, it's a plane in flight. It hasn't settled yet. There's still a lot of uncertainty. So it is a very difficult thing to develop that comprehensive end-to-end transition plan. So it needs to be flexible and it needs to be adaptable. But you still need to plan for it because, as we all know, failing to plan is planning to. There we go. The third one, stakeholder engagement. I'm going to speak a bit more about this later on. You have both internal and external stakeholders, and the communication with those people needs to take place, and you need to prioritize those engagement sessions. And then the last one is the reporting structures, and specifically also the reporting mechanisms. If people are allocating budget to your transition program, they're going to want to know how are things progressing, how is their money being spent, and you need to be able to report on these things and have the necessary reporting frequencies and forums in place to make sure that your stakeholders are well informed. The second C is to clarify your exposure. Yes, I made the C's fit a little bit, but it still works. And my first point is to say that Jibar is not LIBOR. Jibar is our benchmark rate. And yes, there have been lessons from the LIBOR transition, and a lot of the systems can now cater for a backward-looking rate, and that's fantastic. But Jibar is embedded in our financial market. It is used in the curves that we use to fair value our instruments. It is sitting in many, many, many different corners of your organization. LIBOR contracts were fairly easy to identify. They were quite unique, and there was typically, for most organizations, maybe not the banks, only a handful of these. So your exposure to Jibar is going to look very different. It is more complex, and it is much broader in scope. And you need to consider both the size and the complexity of your exposure to Jibar. As an example, you could have a portfolio of 1,000 vanilla interest rate swaps. Fairly simple to manage through this transition. Or you can have a single loan agreement that has many complexities with a Zaronia linked reference rate. So you need to think about both of these elements when you're talking about your exposure to Jibar. And also, we talk about the exposure metrics, and you guys have seen slides on the board today talking about trillions of contracts that our derivatives market has. But that's not what your CRO will want to see. How do you articulate your exposure to Jibar? Is it notional? Is it risk, DV01? Do you classify it according to duration? Because some are shorter duration, some are longer. So how are you actually measuring your exposure to Jibar? And can you put it on a piece of paper? Because your board is going to want to know, how is this transition doing? And you need to actually have a very clear view when you report back up to C-suite levels. Methodology as well, particularly in different business units, they all do their own thing. You need to ensure that when you report on that exposure, the methodology has to be consistent, and they need to speak to each other. Also important to consider there is when you look at your risk limits, how are those things taking into account the different Zeronia and Jibar exposures? You will probably at some point have both. And how are your risk limits actually accommodating both types of exposures? You can't double up. So how you actually look at those metrics and how they filter into your risk appetite is going to be very important. And then the bottom-up and the top-down views. Top-down, that's the strategically important one. That's what your board will want to see. So across the business, across all of your business units, what does your exposure to Jibar look like? Where do you need to pay attention? Where are your problem areas? But also from a bottom-up perspective, and this is where the details and the specifics of all of the contracts will start to matter. You need to literally go and look in every dusty corner of your organization and make sure that you have covered everything. And that's the thing with the Jibar, is it hides. It sits in areas where you don't expect it. It sits in the swap curve. It sits in calibrations. So you really need to make sure that from a bottom-up point of view, you have considered all of those things and you have a plan of action to manage that exposure. And then also your exposure will change. It's not a static thing. It will change over time. It will change as you migrate your positions over to the new rate. And how are you going to measure these exposure changes? That's going to be very important. On the right-hand side, I've listed some functional areas. I think you guys have seen these up on the board quite a bit today. But all of these different areas in the business have their own form of exposure. Financial, you measure exposure according to risk or rands or notionals or whatever. Legal, you might want to measure it according to complexity. We had a very nice diagram up earlier around what the complicated legacy agreements look like. So how are you measuring your exposure from a legal point of view? Reporting, I've spoken about that. In your operating model, where's the exposure sitting? Where is it concentrated in particular business units? Do they need additional support? All of these things need to be considered. Products, both legacy and new products. And then finally, the systems. Are all of your systems able to manage the new rate? And then the third C, and this has been a big theme during the whole morning. I think Mr. Parker, I still have to call him Mr. Parker, mentioned it earlier, is the communication. And most of the people in this room are technical experts. This is not something that comes naturally. And I think this is probably the most important thing that you can start doing right now. I've mentioned the internal and the external stakeholders. Internally, that's your leadership. So you really need to make sure that you convince your C-suite leaders of the scope and the importance of this transition. They need to be on board. Your change implementers, those are the guys on the ground. They're the guys who roll up the sleeves and make things happen. And those are also the guys who have day jobs and other projects. The world did not stand still and wait for Jibar transition to happen. You just saw a whole lot of market initiatives that is being put in place. So your people on the ground are going to need to be equipped, and they need to understand what is happening. I've mentioned in the block there at the bottom the targeted education. Many of these people don't know what a backward-looking rate looks like or how to work with it. So all of the people who literally need to get this over the line and make sure that it works, they need to be engaged early on, and you need to speak to them. And then also across business units for the organizations that have many different areas. Some of the clients that I've seen, they like to manage these in isolation, but particularly if you have funding being moved across different business units in your FTPs, there needs to be a link. You can't have the one business unit go off on its own tangent and have the other ones catch up later. So having those communication channels in place and having everybody on the same page is going to be very important. Externally, our clients, you've heard that a lot as well today. I think Elmarie gave a nice summary of your treat customers fairly requirements. You have to speak to your clients. Some of them won't have Jibar exposure, but the ones who do will also need education. So there's a big role for organizations to play to have an early conversation with your clients and make sure that they are actually on board with what we're trying to do here. Third-party vendors and service providers, your back office people, all of those guys will also need to be engaged. We can assume, they've done LIBOR, Murex, surely, they know, but you still have to have the conversations, and you still have to have those meetings in place. So make sure that you start speaking to them sooner rather than later. And also, one thing that I want to point out is, this is a market transition. Everyone is going through this. You don't want to be the last person when everybody else is busy with their projects. Everyone else has all of their law firms tied up, and there's no capacity in the market to support you on the transition. So speak to your service providers quite soon to make sure that they have capacity to support you in your transition. And the counterparties, those would be the banks, the liquidity providers, whenever you have loan counterparties on those things. Again, consult with them, speak to them, ask them for pricing. All of these things, you can start actually including those in your emails that you send right now. Ask them, what are you guys doing on Zaronia? So have those conversations now. And then the last one is the industry representatives. And that's everyone that you guys have seen on stage today. So if you have questions, if you have comments, if you want to be more involved in any of the working groups, that's always welcome. Reach out to the people who have been here on stage, ask them the questions, and raise your concerns quite early. You can see they're working very hard, but they can only do what the market gives them guidance to do. So if there's something that is specific to your organization and you are worried about it, speak up and communicate that to your industry representatives. How are we doing for time, Zakela? At the bottom, targeted education, I've mentioned that this new Zaronia rate is a technically challenging rate. Many people will struggle with it, so you need to teach them and you need to educate them. Clear communication, big theme, we've spoken about that. And the consistent messaging, and I think that's also another one that's quite tricky. A lot of things are still being finalized, so ensure that your messaging across the business and to your external stakeholders, that's consistent, and you make sure that you keep those guys on board. And then I have one more slide, but Zakela, I think in the interest of time, the slides are going out, so I think you guys can read through this in your own time. It's just the success factors that we've identified for a smooth transition. So have a look. There are some explanatory sentences at the bottom, and pay attention to these ones. It might help you, hopefully with a few less headaches. Okay. There we go. I think I wrapped that up nice and quick. Zakela, are you happy? Okay, awesome. Any questions? Or do you guys want to go for drinks? Okay. Nothing? All done?